Waminjaka Wurundjeri Narapbi. Welcome to Wurundjeri Land and Country. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that we're holding this meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people who managed and looked after these lands for many tens of thousands of years and never ceded them. I'd like to acknowledge my respects and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and to their peoples. I'd also like to welcome people from any other mobs who are here with us tonight. And I'd like to generally welcome all of you. I'm Rob Gardner, and I help to organise these meetings with Chris Moss and Peter Wanfor, who you probably saw at the front. And if people have got ideas for future meetings or want to help on organising other meetings, please talk to us afterwards. We're very honoured tonight to have Dr. Kerry Schott with us, and so I'm not going to talk for very long, and I'm going to hand it straight over to Professor Malte Meinhausen, to talk about Melbourne Uni.
Thank you very much. Welcome tonight. It's our honor to have Kerry Schott here speaking to us tonight. I'm Malte Meinhausen. I'm the director or founding director of the Climate and Energy College and the co-director of the Energy Transition Hub. We have a fantastic cohort of around 35 PhD students looking all into climate and energy transition is of our particular interest. Now, here in Australia, overseas is often seen as a fantastic policy laboratory. And just last October, we were with a delegation with AEMO and others to German ministries and transmission network operators, etc. And we discussed some of the Australian policies. Also, the retailer reliability obligation, or the remnants of the NEC that were then still in play and are still in play. And funnily enough, we just got kind of blank looks like, yes, reliability, system stability, that's an issue that the whole system has to provide and all the parts have to play together. But here in Australia, one could cheekily ask a question whether putting that obligation on consumers to have a particular mix or even a centrally approved mix of different technologies is maybe going against some ideas and principles of the energy market. Again, in Germany, we seem to discuss along very different lines. And here in Australia, often it seems like, what are our particular reliability challenges? Yes, they are there, absolutely. They are also there if big coal power plants suddenly exit the market, or if we have an aging coal infrastructure that suddenly decides from one second to the next to disappear. So there are reliability challenges, and putting the onus on new entrants, etc., could be seen as a burden on the new entrants, and maybe not speeding up the transition that we so urgently need to stay below 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, and most importantly, to transform swiftly Australia into the energy superpower of the zero emissions world, where Australia has all the best prerequisites for being that more than any other developed country. So with these introductory remarks, we are very pleased to have your wisdom here tonight, and we are looking forward to an interesting evening on Australia's energy policies, current status, and the renewables and how they're doing in the market. And I hand over before to Helen. Thank you.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be sharing this stage again with the University of Melbourne, and thank you very much for your support. And having been a regular participant at the various presentations that you put on at lunchtimes, generally, they are always very gripping. I must say that I give a warning to Dr. Kerry Schott to be prepared for some tough questions. Oh, okay, yes, certainly. Okay. I can hear. If I stay here, is it about the location? It's on the desk. Brilliant. Okay. Here it is in front of me. So I'm pleased to be the president of Renew. Renew, as many of you will know, was previously called the ATA, the Alternative Technology Association of Australia. And Renew is one of the oldest, if not the oldest, organisation concerned with sustainable living in Australia. It's quite unique in the fact that it is a national entity. Most of our comparable organisations are state or local, little local community groups who run a sustainability event on composting or insulating your home or PV solar panels. ATA is national. It's also a charity-based organisation and a member-based organisation. And it has a very strong focus on the future. One of the benefits of being a member of Renew is that we have such a wealth of knowledge in our magazines, amongst our members in our branches. We have some 13 branches around the country, and of course, extensive magazines that are available as well. We have an advisory service which is available to our members, and we have at any one point in time about 6,000 to 7,000 households that are paid up members. If you add on all the number of subscribers and the people that attend our events, we're talking in the tens of thousands. We are at the forefront in Australia of, the majority of our members are at the forefront of sustainable living. We enjoy comfortable homes that modulate the temperature, whatever the outside temperature may be. We generally were the first adopters of solar panels, and we're the first adopters for battery for homes. I would wager a bet with anyone that most of our members are also, or that our members comprise the majority of people who own electric vehicles. So our members are at the forefront, they see the future, we are living the future, we're living the dream that many Australians want to have of comfortable, sustainable and affordable homes. So with that, we have a number of events. People will know that we have our annual Sustainable Home House Day, which is a free open event for people. And in 3 weeks' time, we have Australia's largest electric vehicle expo here in Melbourne at the Port Melbourne go-kart facilities where you can test drive EVs, whether it's a car, a scooter, a bicycle or a truck. So come along, there'll be details on our website, and I think actually Robin's going to talk more about that later. But most importantly, and for all the wonderful, similarly nerdy people who are interested in grid security, let's reflect back just briefly. Maybe you're old enough to remember, as I was, that we used to have local grid or local generation facilities. I don't know if anyone can remember, but I grew up around the corner from one in Camberwell. And indeed, the Moorebank Energy Foundation was established out of the sale of local generation facility and energy company, and it was then later amalgamated into the SEC. So those sorts of, there's been continual change. When people say, oh, we can't tamper with the grid, I say, well, hang on, has it ever been in stasis? I don't think so. I think our grid has always been in transformation. So where we are now is just part of that continuum. In a sense, we've gone from decentralised to centralised, and maybe to some extent we're going now to a combination of the two. So there's no doubt in my mind that what we need to do, and for a Renew as well, it has to be an orderly transformation. It is one of the largest, if not the largest grid in the world, which provides significant challenges for us. But as others have said, we can be the renewable superpower if we wish to be, in order to power our grid. And as more people are going to transition from gas, homes and transport to electric, it'll only get more important that we have a good, orderly transition. So at the moment there are various fault lines in the system, and I'm sure Kerry is only too aware of them, as many people in the audience today. It was set up assuming fossil fuel generation, there was no penalty for intermittency, and there was no incentive for stability, strength or storage. So now we're at the cusp of supporting a significant change. And there's no doubt, as Walter has said, we can be the testing ground for how it can be done around other parts of the world. So I think the process that we will have is we will have Kerry giving a presentation and then questions and answers at the end. Kerry, or do you want questions as you go?
No, at the end.
At the end, fair enough. So let me introduce Kerry for those of you who aren't familiar with her face on the television. She's an Australian executive who has had
extensive roles in business and government. She was Managing Director and CEO of Sydney Water, which is how I first remember seeing her on television. She's currently Chair of Moorebank Intermodal Company, Director of NBN, past member of Infrastructure Australia Board, and of course, as we know most recently, the Chair of the Australian Energy Security Board. I'm sure she's got lots of war stories that she could share, but today is nevertheless an important opportunity for us to see and share with her what she sees as some of the directions for us going forward. So without further ado, can we please welcome Kerry Schott.
Thanks very much. Thanks everyone for coming this evening. No, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. What I thought I'd do is run through what the Energy Security Board is trying to do and how we're progressing with that and where we've still got an enormous amount of work to do. And I'll talk about that and then I'll just finish with a few slides about what's happening in the market, because what's actually happening in the energy sector is probably moving faster than the energy system can cope with at the moment. So we just sort of need to keep in front of it, which we just are by a fraction at the moment, I think. But the world is very interesting and changing rapidly. So the Energy Security Board was set up following the Finkel Review, and Alan Finkel and his panel came up with 50 recommendations, as you know, all of which were accepted by COAG Energy Council, excepting one, which was the clean energy target. And the governments at COAG could not agree on a national target, so that was just parked to one side where it remains. And we were then asked as the Energy Security Board to get up to implementing Finkel and making sure that the recommendations were done by the various parties that had to do things. So that's task one. And our second task, which in some ways is just as challenging, is to improve the coordination between the market bodies that basically oversee the electricity industry. And in the national electricity market, which is all the East Coast states and Tassie and South Australia, there are three market bodies, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, and I'll just run through this because it's actually important. There is the AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator that Audrey Zibelman runs, which basically operates the market. And they're the people who every 5 minutes are dispatching power that is bid into the system, and big control systems and bid engines work out what's going on and say to generators, okay, I'm dispatching you, I'm not dispatching you, and people get dispatched depending on their merit order, which is largely determined, almost entirely determined by their price. So at AEMO, during the middle of the day, wind and solar would all be getting dispatched at very low prices, and later in the day when the sun goes down, solar would be getting replaced by coal generation getting dispatched and gas generation getting dispatched. So AEMO has oversight of the entire systems across each of the jurisdictions and has an enormous amount of data because of that. So every minute of the day they are collecting mountains of data about who's feeding power in and where it's coming from, and etc. So that's their job. The Australian Energy Market Commission basically set the rules for the system. There are rules that the generators and the retailers and everybody have to abide by, and they change regularly, and at the moment are going through massive changes because of the changes in the energy system. And the AMC tends to get made up of internally, a lot of very clever people who think very carefully about the way the system runs and basically look at the market design of it and is it working and what do we need to do to change it and so on. There has been criticism pre-Finkel and sort of during Finkel, I think, that they need to move a bit faster on these things than they had been doing, and they are now certainly doing that. And the other thing that they do, apart from setting the rules, is basically they're a sounding board for industry and consumers to say what they think about what's going on. So that's the AEMC. They work very closely with AEMO, who is also a voice in there saying this is what's happening and that's what's happening. And there's always a tension between the two because as an operator you always want things done yesterday and you want to recognise that you are about to have a nervous breakdown if it's not done yesterday, and etc. And the AEMC want to do things in a very process and methodical way and carefully and get it right. So it doesn't really matter who's running those organisations. The engine rooms of them work quite well together, but there's always that sort of time tension really between them. And the other market body is the energy regulator. And regulation in this sector is still really economic regulation, and it's still basically based on rate of return type economic regulation. And it's very interesting with more solar panels and more renewables coming into the system generally. The regulatory system does need to start moving along to catch up with the changes that are going on for reasons that I'll get into. So the regulator has a sort of keeping up job to do, and it's very interesting in Australia because in many ways we are leading the world in what's happening on the ground. So the regulator isn't really able to look over the fence too much at others to see what they're doing because they don't quite have the problems that we're tackling at the moment. So with Finkel, what Alan Finkel basically said, not surprisingly, was you need a plan, and what the plan should be is how we get from where we are in 2017 to where we'd like to be in 2030, which would be significantly lower emissions, and we want a system that's going to be reliable and secure and reasonably affordable for consumers, and also reward people if they're cutting back on demand or putting battery storage in and feeding back into the grid and so on. So it was pretty clear what the end goal was, not spelt out in great detail, but everyone was generally agreed about where we were going to go. And it raises issues then immediately of the trajectory of how you get there. And much debate will be had about that, I think, in coming 12 months and on. But what the Energy Security Board has been doing is implementing the recommendations of Finkel. And if you read our annual Health of the National Electricity Market, you'll see that we think we're sort of about halfway there with the implementation. But the halfway there with getting rule changes and things in place doesn't mean that it's necessarily happening on the ground. So I'll just run through where I think we're broadly at with security and reliability and, dare I mention, emissions reduction, and also governance that I mentioned. Now, on the security front, I think security is a pretty technical area, and I'm not an electrical engineer, but it is actually all about keeping the electricity system stable, and to do that you basically have to keep the frequency within a band, and you have to keep voltage within particular limits, and you need a certain amount of strength in the system so that if there's a disruption or a perturbation, the whole thing isn't going to start diverging and get out of kilter and basically trip the whole system off. So once you do trip the whole system off, as we've seen it in both South Australia and in New York and other places, it takes a long time to get it back up again, and it is best avoided. So on the reliability front, what Finkel recommended was that we get a market in place for what's called fast frequency response. So if there's an alteration in the frequency, we've got some way of quickly adjusting it. And that some way of quickly adjusting it is largely very large batteries. And batteries are very good because you can just push a button and they come on. And they come on within milliseconds, which then gives you half an hour or so to get other things fired up, like a gas plant or something, and it just gives you time to get balance back into the system. And there's now a very active market for fast frequency services, so that's good. The other thing that has happened is that the AEMC proposed a rule change and said that if we need system strength, we are going to make the transmission companies responsible for it. So you, AusNet and Transgrid and Powerlink and Tassie Hydro and others are now responsible for making sure that the system is resilient. Now that was new for them. They'd never had to take that responsibility before. And they now have that responsibility. They've got to keep inertia, as it's called, at particular levels. And to do that, they can go and get a contract with basically a coal-fired generator or a big gas plant, or they can put in synchronous condensers, which are kit that provide inertia. They're free to go and do whatever they like. That seems to be the most efficient, but they have to keep the strength at a particular level. And it is a real challenge for them to do that. If we take a step back, in the days when we had mainly coal-fired plants and a few gas plants around, the system was actually very strong in a system strength sense, because coal plants have and still do have large mechanical bits of kit that spin around. And it doesn't matter if a unit shuts down, that spinning just keeps going. And it keeps the system strong for quite a long time. So what the coal plants were providing as a byproduct that nobody was paying for and really not paying much attention to, frankly, was inertia in the system. And as the coal plants, as a proportion of what's going into the system, get considerably less, there's a big need for inertia. And it's a really important issue for wind and solar coming in, because solar in particular does not bring inertia, and wind can bring a little bit, but not that much. So what we're doing as we change the proportion of the generation in our system is increasing the need for various attributes around security. So we've now introduced measures where there are now markets effectively for inertia and frequency response. Frequency response seems to be working pretty well, and the transmission companies are just starting to get their act together around inertia. But system strength is an issue in the market, and those of you who follow AEMO's publications will see that they put out notices every now and then called loss of reserve notices, and they are largely driven at the moment by security problems, and the number of those that they issue used to be about 8 a year. They're now considerably more than that, and they're mainly related to system things. So practically during summer, practically every weekend they'll be issuing them for South Australia. And it's something that we really do need to come to terms with to get more wind and solar into the systems. So progress, still work to be done, okay, but a big issue. The other thing that in this sort of area that really does need a lot of attention is what the industry called distributed energy resources, which are actually solar panels on roofs. and they can be used to provide frequency and voltage assistance. But the software and the technical stuff that you need to be able to do that isn't readily available. There is some pilot stuff going on. We've got to do more sort of pilot runs with this, get them to work, see how it's going. Still in our learning phases on this. The other thing that we've got to do is get lots of data so we know where all the solar panels are, who's got spare power to put into the grid, who doesn't. We've got to get our regulation caught up with all of this, and we've got to get the skills around to do it. A lot of this is very technical software IT stuff, and the distributed energy stuff is particularly interesting, and it's something that I'll just come to towards the end and show you what's been happening. But in Queensland and WA and South Australia, over 30% of homes have got solar panels on them. An increasing percentage of those have got batteries, and therefore wish to not only take power out of the grid sometimes, but also put it back in. And we've got distribution companies that aren't used to having power flows basically going in two directions. So the distribution companies are used to sitting there getting power delivered to them by transmission companies and then just distributing it out to homes and businesses. And now they've got lots and lots of businesses and homes saying, yes, I'll take it sometimes, but I want to also put it back in the grid. And they've really got to gear themselves up for that. And the regulator's got to allow them to get enough revenue to be able to do that. It's a new thing. Nobody ever thought they might need money for it. It'll probably save a lot of network charges in the long run, but it's just tricky to manage. Now, Australia is leading the world in the amount of solar panels we've got. Victoria and New South Wales are fast catching up with the others. But at the moment, distributed energy resources, solar panels on the roof, are providing around 5% of the energy that the country needs, which is an enormous amount. And probably in the next year or two, it'll be up to 10%. It's increasing very rapidly as people put more and more panels on their roofs. I don't think anybody's building a new house without putting solar panels on. And we are really world leading at this, and the technology that we are going to be putting in place to allow it to be exported back into the grid is going to be quite world leading, and the regulatory stuff that we need to have go with it will be world leading too, if we get there. So that's security, lots of fun and games, some progress. You can sort of see where we need to go more or less. I'm not sure we know how to get there, but we're getting closer. On reliability, which is about basically having enough power when you need it, Alan Finkel made a number of suggestions, and one of them was that generators have to give us a 3-year notice of closure. That's been put in place. The other thing that the Energy Security Board did, as you all know, was try to introduce a reliability obligation along with an emissions obligation in the NEG, and regrettably the NEG died, a spectacular death. The reliability obligation part of it, though, will be in place by June, and it's very important because what it does is it means that the way it works, in June this year it'll become active. AEMO forecasts, they will say, and they will likely say, that in New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia, we anticipate that in 3 years' time we will be short of power. So I sort of guess that that could be what they say. And when they say they're short of power, they don't necessarily mean in the middle of the day, they mean at every single moment of the day. So there will be times when they think they're going to be short of power, and that shortage is likely to be power that's dispatchable. So we're not talking about solar or wind, we're talking about gas or coal or hydro. And no one's particularly well, no one is spelling out what technology it ought to be, but we need power there all the time. So when AEMO says we think we're going to be short in 3 years' time, that's a signal to retailers that they are likely to get hit with an obligation in 2 years after that. So they've got some time to get their act together. And when the obligation comes in, 12 months out from D-Day basically, they must have the load that they're selling to people completely covered. So you're not allowed to sell power that you don't have. So at the moment, nobody's checking. If somebody's selling you power, no one's running around checking that they've actually got it. It's just assumed there's enough in the market to cover it, and typically that's the case. But what AEMO is flagging, and would flag once this obligation comes in, is that a shortage needs to be filled. The retailers have got to go out and get contracts to have their load covered, and that will do several things. It means they've got to go and contract to make sure they're covered all the time. So you can't just go and get a contract with a wind farm. You've also got to get a contract with hydro or something else to back it up, if you don't have that contract in place already. That will mean that we'll get, in areas where there's an enormous amount of renewables, it means that there will also need to be more dispatchable power as backup. So that's the way that will work. The emissions part of it, which the Commonwealth Government, as you know, took off the table, the rest of the COAG Energy Council were in favour of it, whatever the politics of their states, and that continues to be the case. And every time it comes up at COAG, it gets very robust discussion. And it will come back again, I'm sure, in some form or other, but it does depend on everybody at that table agreeing on some national target, which may be something that is a minimum, like at a minimum we will meet our Paris commitments as defined for the electricity industry somehow, or who knows what it would be, but it will be something that across the whole industry you know that there's some minimum that you have to meet. Now on top of that, the states all have their own renewable energy targets, most of which are much more aspirational than the implied Paris target is. And if your target is more aspirational and is actually being delivered, then your reliability obligation is going to be tighter because you'll need more dispatchable. So it'll all work itself out in the wash, but we're all anxiously waiting for the emissions target to get resurrected. I'm reasonably optimistic that it will be, or something like it will be, because we can't just go on with this uncertainty that's around the place for too much longer. The other thing that's happened with reliability is that the operator is having difficulty in keeping the system together for power because all the coal plants are getting older, and so they need more maintenance, and so they break down more often, as happened in Victoria quite recently, when you lost a couple of big plants quite unexpectedly. And when that happens, the operator really needs to have a strategic reserve to hand that they can call up. And there's recently been a rule put through to allow that strategic reserve to be put in place sort of within 12 months earlier than it used to be the case. And that gives AEMO a bit more comfort, I think, that they've got some reserves they can call on, and they have an option about who wants to be part of the strategic reserve. But if you're in that and you're playing that game, you can't also be providing power to somebody. You've got to be there when the operator suddenly says, hey, I really need you because Loy Yang's just fallen over. So we are sort of managing that okay, I think, and I think the reliability matters aren't too bad. I'm more worried about, and I think it's fair to say that the Energy Security Board would probably be more anxious about the security matters than reliability, because with the reliability obligation, even without emissions obligation, we've got some extra tools in place to help handle it. So the other issue that Finkel looked at was around the system plan, and this is interesting because the grid that we've got, that Anne was just talking about, is very old, and it was put there to basically take large amounts of power from the Latrobe and Hunter Valleys to the cities. And it's served us well, but we are now in a world where the power is not just coming from the Hunter and the Latrobe, it's coming from roofs all over the place, but it's also coming from large-scale wind and solar in different geographies. So what we need to do is change the grid. So it's not the old grid, it's a different pattern. We also need to make sure that the grid is going to places which are good for renewable energy. So AEMO has identified in a plan where there are good renewable energy zones. We need to make sure we've got good grid connections into that. And we need to also make sure that we've got more interconnections between the states. At the moment, the links are very thin and get very constrained. And we've got a system where if the wind, there's a lot of climate study going into this, if the wind's blowing in South Australia and northwest Victoria, it tends not to be blowing in northern tablelands in New South Wales and vice versa. And if you're sitting in the AEMO control room, you'll see that if the wind's not getting dispatched in South Australia because it's not blowing, the windmills in around Glen Innes and Armidale will be going flat out and vice versa. So you need connections to be able to take wind from places where it's available and cover places where it's not. The wind pattern in Tassie is a bit different too, so we need to be able to play that sort of game. And each state has a different time zone, as we know, so that's helpful. South Australia's a little later, and Queensland still have their own time zone up there, but those different time zones are quite helpful in managing spreading peaks out. So the grid needs to be changed to allow us to move renewable energy around that works better, and also to give the operator a bit more flexibility. And in the integrated system plan that came out last July, there are various priority projects that were recognised, and there were 4 of them. Upgrade the interconnect between New South Wales and Queensland, upgrade it between New South Wales and Victoria, upgrade the connections into northwest Victoria where there's an enormous amount of renewables going in and not enough connections, and put synchronous condensers into South Australia to get more inertia into the South Australian system. Those 4 projects are all being monitored like hawks by the Energy Security Board, and if they run late or fall behind, all manner of evil will descend upon the companies involved. We are streamlining the regulatory process to get that done very smoothly and quickly. The states are working very hard to make sure that the planning approvals don't get held up unnecessarily. We're also working very hard to ensure that the companies can make equipment orders early and we don't end up having to sit around for 6 months for a regulatory approval before equipment's ordered. So all things are being done to try and get these things in place by 2022. And 2022 is a bit of a magic date in New South Wales because that's the date that Liddell disappears from the system. And the other project that a lot of attention is being paid to is the South Australia-New South Wales interconnect. And at the moment, South Australia is linked into the system through a Victorian interconnect, which probably should be upgraded at some point. But before that, the interconnect into New South Wales needs to be made, and it's not a huge job, and that would give more flexibility in allowing South Australia to export their wind into New South Wales, and for New South Wales to basically provide a bit of dispatchable backup to them. And just in terms very broadly of where all the power is, Queensland will for a long time have coal. They have new coal-fired plants. In New South Wales, most of the coal in New South Wales will be retired, even if you don't do anything, by the mid-2030s. Only Mount Piper is likely to last longer, and economically it may get retired much earlier than that. And similarly in Victoria, most of the coal will be gone during the 30s. So we are in a world where we've got coal plants exiting because they're getting old and retiring. It is not economic at this stage of technology to replace them with coal. They'll be replaced with hydro and gas and renewables. So that's where we are. And that sort of gets a bit to the trajectories around how fast you do this, and we've just got to keep the system together while we're doing this and try and keep the costs down for consumers as we go. And moving on to consumers, so on the system plan, I'm really very pleased with the progress we've made with that. AEMO's done a pretty good job with their first integrated system plan. It's got a few hairs on it. They're doing another one that'll be ready by the end of this year, I think, which will be better than the first one. And one of the big changes in the second one will be that instead of the coal plants retiring at the end of their technical life in the plan, they will retire when they economically go broke. Because what's happening as the renewables are coming in, they're making coal less and less commercially viable. So we will model what we think is going to happen with coal retirements. One of the things around the grid that we've got to pay more attention to is access to the renewable energy zones and connections. There's a lot of difficulty in the renewables industry around those issues, which I'm happy to take questions on. Which brings me to consumers briefly. We all know about prices. Prices have been far too high, really largely due to poor regulation in Queensland and New South Wales jurisdictions some years ago, and due to coal and gas prices being too high, well, being higher. They are what they are, but it is those things that led to the retail price being high. There's no sign that retail prices are suddenly going to start jumping up like that again. I don't imagine we'll have network prices going up again, and the wholesale price has been pretty stable. So while it moves around a little bit, prices, the worst is over on the price front. What we do need to do more about on the energy front is energy efficiency and more productivity in homes and businesses, and that's sort of starting to happen, but I think we can do a lot more, and we can also do a lot more in setting up things where if people want to engage in demand response, they get rewarded for it. And nobody is suggesting that people should cut back power when they need it, like air conditioning when it's 40 degrees. But, for example, there are aggregators who are aggregating pool pumps in Sydney, and this sounds ridiculous, but it's actually very helpful. So on a 40-degree day when power is really needed, they will turn all those pool pumps off between sort of noon and 5 o'clock in the evening. And who cares whether their pool pump's on or off at that time, as long as it's on later and the pool's okay. So there are things like this that you can do that are very clever, that people should get rewarded for. So there's a lot to do on that energy efficiency front, and the Energy Security Board hasn't frankly paid a lot of attention to it, but we do need to. And that brings me to governance. There's still a lot to do, but while all the market bodies are so busy trying to keep the show on the road, I'm not all that inclined to drop grenades on top of them. So we'll just, I think, park that for a little while. And what I thought I'd do, and this is perhaps the most interesting part for you, is just show you what's happening on the ground, because while we're trying to grapple with all of these things, what's happening on the ground is amazing. And this is out of a report that AEMO put out about the last quarter of last year, so it's pretty topical. So the first thing is, this is a comparison of demand in the national energy market, which is everybody except WA and Northern Territory, from 2013 to 2018, and you can see across the whole NIM it's been pretty flat. Victoria and South Australia between 2013 and 2018, it's really come down remarkably. And the thing that has kept demand both flat and decreasing is rooftop solar, because it doesn't get counted in these numbers. So it's not that people are necessarily using less power. What it is they're using power off their roof. It's not getting into the operational statistics, and so demand is relatively flat. The next graph will be familiar to those of you in the industry, and this is, for reasons that I sometimes puzzle about, called a duck curve. But this is South Australia in the last quarter, last year, and this is the daily operational demand, and that blue line shows you that at round lunchtime in South Australia, the demand was hardly anything, sort of 600 megawatts. And normally, it was like in 2010, that blue line up the top, it was about 1,600 megawatts. Now, the reason that demand in South Australia in the middle of the day is 2/10 of nothing now is their renewable energy. So you can see that renewable energy, particularly their solar and wind, sort of coming on at about 7 in the morning, really sort of hitting their straps in the middle of the day, and then tends to go off around about 4 in the afternoon. And then you sort of start getting back up into higher demand levels. Having a system that behaves like that with such low demand is very hard to keep stable. So that's why I was talking about stability early on. South Australia is very interesting because South Australia is running with 50% renewables. There is no other jurisdiction, with the possible exception of Denmark, who is running with more in the world. So 50%, this is actually sort of in the system, not built and not doing anything. This is actually in the system. And 50% of wind and solar. So renewables that don't bring, not hydro that brings synchronous power with it. So 50% wind and solar, very good, difficult to manage. Interconnectors will make it easier because we can spread it around a bit. But you can see that drop in demand in the middle of the day and how dramatic the change has been since 2010, which is that top dotted line, down to 2018, October. And that, you know, that's a pattern now. Just in terms of the amount of renewables in each state, Tassie is running some days on 100% renewables, but they're blessed, as you know, with hydro. So they're running wind and hydro basically. Their aim is to be 100% all the time. Definitely achievable if you've got hydro, because that brings you system strength and the things you need. New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland. Victoria and Queensland have aspirational targets to get up around 45-50%. South Australia shows you can do it, but we've really got to do a bit more work to make sure we're all comfortable about resilience. New South Wales, while they're not banging on about it, are actually putting renewables in at a very fast rate and are pretty much keeping pace with things on the ground, as in Victoria and Queensland. So the other thing I thought you'd be interested in is what's happening with wind and solar in between last year and this year. This is just 12 months worth of solar and wind, and it really is truly phenomenal what has happened. There's been, year-on-year 26% growth in renewables. So the large-scale solar on the left, all these graphs incidentally come out of an AEMO report that you can find, but big increase in large-scale solar, large increase in small-scale solar, and you can see there that it's across all jurisdictions. The only place that's not sort of going gangbusters on the small-scale solar is Tassie, probably for obvious reasons. And then huge increase in wind, but it's really the large-scale solar and small-scale solar that's been driving it last year, not necessarily every year. But we are really powering ahead on the renewables front. And this is a chart that AEMO put together about what happened in Q4 2017 on the left and Q4 2018, and you can see there the contribution of rooftop solar, which is the dark part of the supply chart. And you'll see in the middle of the day, lunchtime, it is really pouring power into the use, and actually that power, that NEM power, is going into the grid through batteries. So we're making big headways there, and it's making a huge contribution along with the utility scale renewables that are going in PV. So, and finally, what's happening with emissions? The red line there is emissions intensity, and as you can see, since 2010, it's been coming down reasonably, at a reasonable gradient, I suppose. And the volume of emissions that we're actually putting up there has been coming off. That is without, what's driving that is several things. Coal-fired generation ageing and retiring. There's been lots of retirements and they will continue. The other thing that's driving it is the entrance of wind and solar. The entrance of more hydro, if Snowy 2 is approved and goes ahead, that will provide more dispatchable power and allow more renewables into the system, but also, of course, bring emissions down. By the time we're looking at this chart in about 5 years' time and 10 years' time, it will be quite radically on the downward slope. So while I don't think any of us are necessarily thrilled with what the country has been doing on the emissions front, I just wanted to leave you with this chart to say, you know, it's not spectacular, but it's headed in the right direction. But what is spectacular is what is actually happening in the field with large-scale wind and solar, and particularly rooftop solar, which we have to work out how to use properly within our system. And it's tricky, and no one else in the world has got this problem. If it is a problem, well, it is a problem, but it's a nice problem to have, I suppose. And I thought I'd finish there, and if anyone has any questions, I'm very happy to take them.
So thank you to Kerry, and on that note, I'll hand over a gift for you. You may not have expected this, but it's how appropriate. It's a little solar looky light that you can take anywhere with you.
Good.
Totally user-friendly, and how apt.
Thank you.
Take it to work.
Exactly.
And
you.
also some magazines from the
thank you.
organisation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, questions. To start with, oh, yes, you are going to be. Would you like to take a seat?
Yeah.
You might need a seat to take some of the questions. Can you please give your name and where you're from? Because it's also interesting for us to see, you know, the diversity of people that are in the room, if you're from anywhere or of any kind of organisation. So, where shall we start? Go on. Shall we start with Andrew? Andrew Redway, wearing the Renew T-shirt. Andrew, would you mind standing up?
I'm Andrew Redway from Renew. The question is, who is responsible for building the assets to replace the generators that retire, and who should the public hold to account if that doesn't go smoothly?
The assets that are being built to replace coal as they retire are just basically being built through the wholesale market. And at the moment, the commercial drivers for that are the RET, which, as you know, finishes in 2020. But the cost of solar and wind have come down so sharply that if you want to supply power now, it is by far the cheapest thing to do is to do it through wind or solar. So it's just being commercially driven. The thing that will drive dispatchable power coming into the system, like hydro and gas peaking, will be the retail reliability obligation. So if you're going to sell power, you've got to have power every minute of the day you're selling it. So that all happens in the wholesale market. So that's what's driving.
Does that answer your question, Andrew?
Maybe the second part about who should the public be
Holding to account.
Who do you hold for account? Who do you hold for account? I think you hold the whole industry to account, actually, if that doesn't work. And one of the for the economists in the room, one of the key questions around this, I think, around the market design is that we do have a very well functioning electricity market for energy that worked very well, up until about 5 years ago, but with so much renewables coming in that are just coming in out of the market, so because of the RET or because of power purchasing agreements or something else, they're not coming in the same way that by NEM market-driven things, and that is distorting the market a bit. And whether it's distorting it enough to blow the whole thing up or not is a matter for debate. There are people on both sides of the fence, and I think the retail reliability obligation will see chickens coming home to roost on that fairly quickly. So ask me in 18 months' time.
Come back here in 18 months' time. The gentleman behind you.
I come from a Marxist socialist stream.
Sorry, your name and where might you?
Morris Alexander.
Thank you.
I'm a member of the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy. In our philosophy studies, we've come to the conclusion that there's a huge problem in the world with the market being used. And what I hear from you is that Australia currently is relying entirely on market mechanisms worked by, so all the bodies that you're talking about, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, are effectively separate private companies, that sort of thing, whose one object is profit, one of their objects. The problem we see is that where you've got this in the supply of an entire country, where all the members of the country are dependent on that particular part of their life ability, i.e. we're all dependent on energy. Where do you leave that with markets? The problem is that there's huge problems because the markets don't really care about doing things for the general good. They're more inclined to do things only where it suits their profit motives. So my question to you is, don't you think that we should change the whole system, get a government with huge money like even something similar to the NBN, where the capital money is coming from the government or governments, so that all these things can be done with capital that doesn't have to be dependent on a profit-making organisation?
The fact that the fact that electricity is an essential service is a very important point, and it would be wrong if you left thinking that it was just all about the market, because there's an enormous amount of planning and government intervention in electricity. And the integrated system plan and the grid that I was just talking about is all about a planning mechanism and what is going to get done under that. Some by government companies and some by privately owned companies will be in line with that plan. But the other thing to bear in mind is that Snowy and Snowy 2 is going to be is a government-owned company, and it will do as the Commonwealth Government effectively allows it to do. And the transmission networks that will be needed to go with Snowy 2 will probably need some government support as well. So it really is a mixed. It's a mixed situation. It's not. There is a market there. It works okay, I think, for what it does. And in answer to the earlier question, I said we'll see whether it works well or not. There's a couple of views about whether it's working properly or not. But don't think for a moment that there's not a lot of planning and government intervention. And state governments are setting renewable targets, and that's driving an enormous amount of change.
There's a question up the back. Thanks, Robin.
Yeah, hello. My name's Phil. I'm from the Transition South Island, which is in Geelong.
I'm not sure if your microphone's working.
We could hear you though, Phil.
Yes, yes. The acoustics are actually pretty good in here.
My name's Phil. I'm from the Transition South Island in Geelong. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for the presentation, Kerry. Very interesting. I wonder if, as much as we all want cheap energy, I wonder if energy is actually already too cheap. We've already burned through the highly concentrated forms of energy, oil, coal and gas, and now we have a situation where renewables only look cheap against the once cheap fossil fuels. As we try and drive down the price of energy, investors head for the exits. But we have the problem that we have an economic system that needs cheap energy for businesses to operate profitably. But energy costs are increasing year on year. The cheap energy in Bass Strait, gas is depleting 18% year on year. And that was our one-off endowment of cheap energy for Victoria, and it's gone. So how do we navigate this situation? Are we in a situation where we have permanently expensive energy? And that's really my question.
I don't think prices are likely to get any more severe than they have been. But the equilibrium, if you like, is going to be made up of a large mixture of wind and solar, which are very low in price, effectively free apart from the cost of building the plants, and that's falling. And they will be mixed alongside hydro and gas peaking. While they're not cheap, nor are they expensive, because if you're running pumped hydro, you'll be pumping up using renewables. So I could see an equilibrium arising, which is actually not too bad. Australia is in a different position from a lot of other countries who have very cheap alternative sources of fuel. And while we have plenty of fuel around, it isn't cheap. And the United States is finding their transition a lot easier because gas is so cheap, similarly in Canada. And Europe is dealing with a transition with a huge interconnection between countries, where they're moving hydro and nuclear and all manner of things around very freely, which, being an island, we just don't have the capacity to do that, or the population, I might say. So but I think where we're headed is not a bad space at the end of it.
There's a question down the front. Can people put up their hands again, and I'll see.
And batteries are coming down in price too, and that technology is
4, 5.
improving.
Great.
Thank you. My name is Peter Zagorski. I come to the energy system with a lens of climate and weather. Naturally, my question about economics, though. So, I understand that the rules are written so that generators can't be priced for exporting. So there's a connection fee between the generator and the transmission operators. There might be a connection fee, but as I understand it, there's not a fee for export. And I'm wondering, I don't understand the economics, why might that be, and could that change?
I don't think that's right. I think there are rules around gas exports, but not around, for example, if you wanted to generate hydrogen through a lot of renewables, go for your life. I don't think so. And
maybe I mean, if I know for a fact for distribution, I understand, I haven't read the rules for transmission, but my understanding was that there's no clear rule that maybe there should be. Maybe that would help.
Sorry, do you mean export like a gas out of the country, or do you mean gas or power into the grid?
So I've got a wind farm generating out in Western Victoria or whatever, and it needs to connect to the grid somehow.
Yeah.
Someone's got to pay for that.
Yeah.
At the moment, there's a grid team that does it.
well, at the moment, consumers pay for it after a period of time, and but the generator doesn't pay for it.
Why is that?
That just happens to be the rule at the moment, and for it's worked quite well in the past in that generators have connected to the grid for nothing effectively, and consumers have picked up the tab because it's more power coming in. With the renewable energy zones and the connection requirements there, we are actually looking at the access arrangements and the connection fees again, because one of the things that's been happening with so much renewables coming in, often from similar geographies, the loss factors are interfering with each other. So people's marginal loss factors, they thought they were sort of 40% and they're now 40% lower than that. So we are looking at that, and we are also looking at how to appropriately charge for those connection fees. So it's on the work plan.
Oh, there's more hands going up. You didn't have that question is yes, up the back. We might have to.
Hi, my name's Colin. I'm from Northern Rose Flora in Northern. My question is there a risk that an overemphasis on reliability will lead to gold plating and overinvestment in infrastructure? And if so, how can it be that the cost of this isn't passed on to consumers?
The risk of overinvestment in reliability would mean you end up with more dispatchable power effectively than you need. I don't think, because most of that is happening through the market rather than through government direction. I think the chances of cost blowout on that front are probably relatively low. There is always a risk that we will get planning wrong and have a cost blowout on changes to the grid and do things in the wrong places or too early. And everybody's very conscious of that. I'm sure we'll make mistakes, but you need to try and make sure that if you do, they're as minimum as possible. And one of the reasons why the rule setting is with the AEMC and not with the operator is to try and avoid that, because if you, the operator would hate me saying this and would say it's not true, but if you left the decision to the operator, for example, about how much strategic reserve they need, they would choose more than what consumers would probably feel like they should pay for.
Question. Right, about the man in the middle with the white striped shirt.
a few women asking questions too.
Oh, good. Excellent.
The ESB run by a woman, AMO run by a woman, AMR run by a woman.
Oh, yeah, maybe afterwards, Robin. Yes, first, the man in front first. Yes, keep going, keep going.
I'm Max, I'm visiting from the United States.
Welcome.
My question is, Australia has some of the biggest reserves of thorium in the world. What barriers lie in place for Australia exporting this material and capitalising on nuclear energy?
Australia is a major exporter of uranium to countries that are politically sort of approved. So we try not to export it to people who are going to make bombs and drop them on other people. So you have to have signed various atomic agreements to be able to receive uranium shipments. Australia internally has politically made a decision that they don't want to go nuclear, and that was something that's been decided a number of times a long time ago, and I don't think anybody's got the appetite to revisit it. The other thing about the economics of nuclear has changed, and you may know more about this than I do, but the reason why it was not particularly pushed was that nuclear plants tend to be a very large scale, and if you're somewhere like France or the United States, it makes sense. But when you're a country like Australia with a population that's so much smaller and spread around the place, it really was pretty hard to make them commercially stack up. So they were never really politically acceptable, and because of the economics, I think the industry never really pushed it that hard. There are still people that correspond with me saying that we should be looking at nuclear. It doesn't go away, but...
Robin, the gentleman, yes.
Derek Ryan from Geelong. Look, with this very small population we have in Australia and this massive, bigger than anywhere else in the world, renewable energy resource, can you see us being a major export of energy in the near future?
I can see us being a major exporter of hydrogen, and the governments are doing a lot of work on this, and there are a number of important pilot studies going on. One in Victoria making hydrogen out of actually coal-fired generation powering it, but also one in South Australia that's based on using renewables. And those pilots are being used to try and work out whether we can get this to be commercial or not. And there's a lot of, the Japanese have Olympic Games coming up in 2020, which they want to be the Hydrogen Olympics, and they're, of all things, and they're spending a lot of money in various joint arrangements with Australia on this matter. So that's one way, but yes, definitely we can be.
Robin, immediately behind you.
Darren Warner from Eastern Climate Action Melbourne. You mentioned earlier you didn't see that new coal generation was viable from a cost or investment point of view. Have you got any comments about the federal government's current request for generation of feeding power and the fact that reported there have been a number of submissions for new coal generation in Victoria and South Australia?
First of all, I have a question on nuclear energy, and then I have a question on coal generation and the Commonwealth Government. Just on the coal generation issue, not everybody in the Commonwealth Government believes this piece of advice, but the cost of the low emission coal plants is still a very expensive way to generate power, and so just the basic economics of it at this point with the technology that we've got, it's just it won't fly. And And the other reason why it's very difficult in Australia is that the Australian banks, for all of their bad behaviour, have basically left the market and will not lend money. And that's basically because of their shareholders not wishing them to do so.
Hands up again. We've got two here, one and one over there. This gentleman, I think, was one of the early batch.
Thank you. Simon Coburn, a student on the Master of Energy Systems course at Melbourne. Thank you. Kerry, I've got a question related to coming back to market and export. You see a situation in the future where, like our gas system is now, our generators can earn more money selling our electricity overseas, and we have a shortage in Australia. And can you see a role for those three, or the Energy Security Board, in such a situation?
No, I can't see that happening, but one would hope that governments issuing export licences have learnt their lesson about that. The gas situation, I think, has been sorted out, and I just can't see the export of hydrogen, for example, getting into that strife.
Or HVDC or something like that.
Yeah. Well, obviously you would want to keep track of it, but it really is a government responsibility to not be exporting things that we need. Yeah.
There's a fellow, there's more people putting up their hands. As you answer questions, more questions arise, Kerry. A fellow with his laptop up. Oh, yes, the fellow up the back and then the one with the laptop. Thank you.
Graham Baston, Renew member. I was delighted to hear you bring up the hydrogen question. I wondered if you had any comments on the CSIRO ammonia hydrogen system, which enables you to actually export it.
This is not an area that I'm really very familiar with, and I know only to the extent that Dr. Finkel's been presenting hydrogen issues to the COAG Energy Council the last 2 or 3 meetings, and I know that there's a lot of work going on that ARENA has been doing some funding of, and I know there's a lot of joint work going on with Japan, so that's about the extent of my knowledge. No. So I really can't comment on that. But there are a lot of people around who would be very happy to come and talk to you about these initiatives.
Yes, thank you.
Dave Ross, Australian Energy Daily. I'm keen to get your thoughts on the trend towards renationalisation of state-owned power orgs. There's a proposal out of New South Wales Labor recently. Do you think those will affect the investment landscape?
Well, I honestly don't know. It's I'm not sure that it would achieve anything at this point. It gets back a bit to the question about you need to have a view about how you want government to intervene and how much of their intervention do you want. And given the behaviour of governments, be careful what you wish for. But no, I don't really have a view on it.
It's an interesting question because in Hamburg, the population there has just voted to renationalise their electricity system, which is just buy it back. Gentleman here and here. Oh, well, yes, given you're up there, thank you for that, Robin. Yes.
Hi, I'm Adam Bisnich from Total Iran. We're currently building the Carmel solar farm up in Mildura, which is including a synchronous condenser.
Excellent.
So my question was about the ISP released by AMO about all the priority projects that are required. It's obvious there's quite a lot of infrastructure and quite a lot of capital that's required. Who is responsible for paying for this infrastructure? And if so, what are the economic advantages of owning this?
Yeah, that's a good question. The modelling that AEMO did was quite a complex planning exercise of optimisation, but we have followed it up with some modelling of pricing because we didn't want things happening that was going to send prices in the wrong direction. The 4 priority projects that I mentioned are all relatively small scale, so they're hundreds of millions, not billions, and in a couple of cases they're less than 100 million. So they will be paid for by the transmission companies, and the cost of that will be picked up through consumer bills over the course of many years. But the impact on prices of those priority projects, and in fact of integrating the system plan, is to send prices everywhere down, with the exception of Queensland, where prices go up a little bit, but generator returns go up a lot. And if you think about it, it makes sense because transporting power from New South Wales into South Australia causes South Australian bills to fall considerably. New South Wales has got a big population, and the cost is spread across a lot of people, and frankly they won't notice. But they benefit from power being exported from Queensland, and the export of power from Queensland is cheaper than, for example, power from Liddell. So these things have very positive effects, and the Victorian New South Wales interconnector has similar price effects, because what happens with the interconnects is power gets moved to where it's most expensive, so it actually levels everything out. And the reason why in Queensland the prices tend to go up a little bit, and I stress a little bit, is that the Queenslanders are largely exporting into the rest of the NEM through New South Wales, but it'll go everywhere. And their generators are therefore making more money. But interestingly, the Queensland government has a policy of distributing the profits of, to go back to Marxist theory, the profits of the generators to consumers, so the consumers will get a benefit through that redistribution. So the modelling that we've done is quite supportive of it, and I know AEMO have got somebody to do some more pricing modelling, so it'll get refined as we go along.
But I think we've got a question here, and then we might one more there. This gentleman here has had his hand up for quite some time, so please go, sir.
Yeah, my name is Stuart Rora, private individual. The Tesla battery in South Australia, I believe, has been quite a commercial success.
Yep.
Why aren't private companies falling over themselves to reproduce that and build batteries all over the country, particularly to stabilise solar and wind?
It is starting to happen, and there are some battery banks sort of on the planning drawing boards. The way that the battery bank in South Australia is making money is through selling fast frequency response services, and it's providing system security in South Australia where it is really badly needed. The other jurisdictions aren't quite in that position yet, but they're heading there. And I think, I can't remember who it is, but I think it's AGL has got a big bank sort of on the drawing board. So they're coming. And it's correct that the battery in South Australia has been making some money and has teamed up with wind farms too to provide firmness so that they can contract with the retailers for any hour of the day. So,
well, first woman has put up her hand. I was going to say, can we make this the last question for the night?
Yes, my name is Peter. I'm from Bentley. I'm a private individual, not representing anyone here. I just want to say thank you for your talk. It's very well aligned with some of the fundamental understanding of mine of the market. You notice, you said several times that, different parts of the world sort the things differently. I have a question about a rather dumb matter. I noticed that different countries, for example, set different targets for their running their conditioners. So the more groupy countries recognize that there's a common rule in actually running their conditions at homes at a higher temperature. More individualistic countries, like I guess Australia, would actually pride themselves in running them at 18 degrees at home. Because I have a lot of colleagues that actually come to work in the morning and say, yeah, my system works at 18, right? Now, if you look at Japan, when they had a problem with Fukushima, Japan's normal level of running air conditioners, that is actually recommended by the government, is 26 degrees. Because generally in Japan, lower than that is not considered healthy to start with, and also not patriotic or not nationalistic, whichever way you go. Now, have you done any modeling at all? How many solar panels, let's say look at the typical solar panels, bringing the temperature culturally in this country, say 5 degrees up, 3 degrees up, how many would that be? 1 panel? 100 panels? 1 million panels?
So I don't quite understand the question. So the question is so is the question, how many panels do you need to run an average air conditioner?
Basically, this is a renewables discussion, right?
Yeah.
A bit with coal and nuclear, right? But so, how much would that help in general to offset some peaks in the short term before the industry will sort themselves out, assuming that it will happen, right?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Peter. We haven't actually done any modelling on that, but it is the sort of thing that the energy efficiency people will have done some work on, I think.
Indeed.
Yes. So I'm sorry not to be helpful, but it hasn't come across my radar.
I can tell you that we have just installed our first aircon because we recognise it's just going to get hotter from here on, and we run it solely on our solar PV on hot days for a short period of time to bring the house down to 22. 22. But that's the first question that we've had regarding energy efficiency and demand management. Yes, that's right. And I think that if I had my time, I'd ask Kerry a question around how much saving we can make into the grid around simple initiatives like that, and if that's actually on the radar anywhere around any of that kind of demand management or kind of activity.
Yeah, demand management's definitely on the radar, and it's a really important issue. I'm sorry.
All right, Robin's giving...
Just a very quick one. Wendy Cox, Monastery. Just remember reading recently about China wants to send a satellite up to do a 24-hour solar power plant. Have we had any thoughts in that area?
No, but most satellites actually have solar panels on them that power them to stay in the appropriate positions they're in, strangely.
Is this to send power back to Earth?
Yes, yes. No, I don't know about that.
Anyway.
We've got enough sun here.
Can you imagine sending something that kind of distance? Okay, so you'd like me to...
Yeah, next month is...
Yes, all right. So here we have, Robin has handed me a little reminder. Thanks you so much. Why don't we give a round of applause?